So I started volunteering for Guardians about 2.5 years ago now. It started as a way to just pad out my CV, add more, add anything to it really. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and my teachers always went on about how employers really love volunteering, which is definitely not true. So when I heard my school talking about it, I decided to sign up. I was only meant to do it for 6 months, but I actually ended up loving it. We didn't do much, just picked up their shopping, taught them how to use phones and computers so they could call and chat online. But mostly it was just company for them, which I know sounds cliche or like what everyone says, but well, when their family can't be there all the time and their partners or whatever are gone, it gets pretty lonely for them. And like I said, I loved it. Getting to hear all their stories about what they've seen and experienced, watching their face light up as they tell you about their friends or parties or dancing. Yeah, it's incredible. I used to see this one man called Ralph who fought in World War II when he was just 16. He told me how him and his mates forged their sign-up papers and they got found out halfway to France, and he'd say with this little grin, just, "Oh, it was too late by then." He was a real cheeky chappy. Or there was this woman, Maureen, who told me about this Irish lad she knew who gave her a gold watch for her 21st birthday. Only she didn't know at the time that was an Irish tradition of proposing, so she told him to sling his hook. She felt far too young for marriage. And she'd tell me that a year later she ended up married to her best friend, so. But the person I most loved to visit was Elizabeth. She was this tiny, fierce woman who barely spoke to me when I first started visiting her, except to criticise the service I worked for. I remember thinking, oh, this is why she's ended up alone, how angry and mistrusting she is. But there was something about her, this charm behind the eyes. The way she would begrudgingly press a cup of tea into my hand, or a couple of biscuits, and not the cheap ones either, mind you. I'm talking proper chocolate digestives. Even jammy Dodgers when she got to know me better. And after a while, she realised I wasn't going anywhere fast, so once I got her shopping and she'd handed me my tea, she'd tilt her head gently towards the telly, inviting me to come watch Bargain Hunt or Countdown. She absolutely loved Countdown. So we'd sit in silence for a few weeks just watching the TV, and then one day, irregular! She started taking part. She wasn't watching placidly, she was using it to keep her mind active, and although she never said it, I could tell she wanted me to join in too. It's like she let her mask slip, this mask of her as an angry old person that she used to protect herself in case I was disrespectful or annoying or whatever. But I'd gone through, I guess, and we started turning it into a little game, a little competition, and suddenly I was coming over more and more just to play Countdown. She'd smile and laugh whenever she got a particularly good word, and she would curse up a storm whenever I beat her at the numbers game. But it was all good fun with us, I actually think she began to like me. She would ask me about my life, about my friends, what I wanted to do when I grew up. Cheeky shit. It's like she was genuinely interested in what I had to say, in my experiences. And she started to tell me about herself too. She would open up about her youth, about how she was the life of the party, which was hard to imagine. She was clever and loud, and all the boys wanted her, apparently. But when she met Rod, she was love-struck. Of course, she did not show it, but he proposed just 6 weeks after they first met. She told him her mother would kill her, but that didn't stop him. He just waited a while longer before trying again. She told me that she was planning on saying no the second time, just to toy with him, but she couldn't resist him again. She would smile the whole time she talked about Rod, reminiscing about her love. They had a daughter together who inherited Elizabeth's smarts. She would insist it was all her, not Rod at all. She inherited his temperament though, very quiet and reserved. Nothing like her confident and loud-mouthed mother. Rod died suddenly when he was 51. They hadn't known anything was wrong. She just woke up one day and he did not. She didn't tell me anything more than that, and I knew better than to push it. Besides which, the thought of losing someone you love so much, so suddenly and without warning, it wasn't really something I wanted to learn more about, Her daughter moved to America for work when she was 24. She still came back to visit for Christmases and, called whenever she could, but Elizabeth was clearly proud of her, but it had also taken its toll, Her husband dying and then her daughter leaving just a few years apart. I began to see how she had become so angry, closed off, mistrusting. And things got pretty busy for me after that. I was offered a full-time paid position by Guardians. I was finally a fully fledged Guardian, whatever the hell that meant. But with the extra hours and responsibilities, I didn't have enough time to give to volunteering as I would have liked. It was around a month before I could go see Elizabeth again. When I got there, I remember thinking that I really need to do something about that garden. It's just this tiny little space at the front of a house, but it was overrun with weeds, which wasn't that unusual because Elizabeth wasn't much of a gardener and she couldn't get around very easily by herself, but, normally I was there to help out, She didn't answer the door when I knocked, which again wasn't that weird. It really depends on her mood whether she'd come and say hello or not. But luckily I knew there was a key under the mat, so I just let myself in. And there she was, just sitting in her chair, a cup of tea beside her, watching Countdown, naturally. Took her a while, but eventually she acknowledged me. She turned to me and said, "Took you long enough." Like I just popped down to the shops, not been gone for an entire month. I fetched her a cup of tea because hers had gone cold, and I noticed that her skin was pale, thin, like almost translucent. And when we sat watching Countdown, I could tell that something had changed. Something was different, was off, She wasn't coming up with these great words anymore. She just sat there, watching. I tried to get her to join in, but nothing. At the time, I thought that maybe she was just upset with me, that I hadn't seen her in so long. She didn't ask me about my job, where I'd been, nothing. I only stayed about an hour. I promised her I'd be back the next day, though. I don't think she believed me, but yeah. When I left, I ran into her neighbour, who said that he was glad I was back. They were beginning to worry about her. They hadn't seen her in a while, and they were this close to coming to check on her. I told him that, she was fine, but I'd be back a bit more often because I wanted to check on her. She wasn't quite herself. And then I started getting this creeping feeling at the back of my neck, like this feeling of dread. And as I was turning to leave, he stopped me and asked who the person was who was visiting her 2 weeks ago. Apparently, from his patio, he has a view into her living room. And for a couple of nights, there was a man standing behind her armchair, just watching the TV. But he couldn't see his face, but he was dressed completely in black. I laughed it off, I figured that it was probably just someone from Guardians. That's how I explained it to myself. And I made a mental note to go check on it with the company when I could. So I came back the next day. It's really important to keep your promises with vulnerable people, especially when you're trying to get them to open up and accept help. which is something I've learned on some course or whatever. Same thing happened again. She didn't open the door, but she was just sitting there in her chair, watching a TV, tea beside her. Only she was in practically the same position as she was yesterday, like she hadn't moved at all. And the tea was just grim and the milk had split in it. And it was in the exact spot I put it yesterday. Like, I remember exactly where I placed it and it had not been moved at all. Obviously, this raised up some red flags, so I went around the kitchen inspecting it more than I did the last time I was there. It's nothing too bad. It was a bit more dusty than it should have been, and there were some plates that had been there a bit too long, but I cleaned it all up and just went back to sitting with her, watched some TV, and then went back home. I came back the next week and it was clear that Elizabeth was not taking care of herself. Like, the garden was just absolutely wild at this point. And there's this awful smell in the house, and she just sat there watching Countdown. She smiled at me this time though. Said she was glad I was back. She was going to win this episode. But it was like this uncomfortable smile. Like, I would look over to her every so often and she would just be grinning. I'd barely seen her smile for more than a few minutes, let alone an entire episode of Countdown. I went around the kitchen and I had to throw out a load of mouldy food that she just let go off. There had been some bugs that had gotten into some of the biscuits, and I had to make her a black tea because all the milk was just completely congealed. I put a call in. Obviously, she could not stay in that house alone if she was not going to look after herself. They told me they'd get to her as soon as they could, which... It was a few days later when I came over for the last time. She looked so happy. Like, I could really see that person from the stories, that vibrant 25-year-old socialite. She told me about the latest Countdown conundrum, how she got it in under 15 seconds. The house felt cozy and warm, like all those times I used to visit. But I couldn't get that smell out of my nose. Even now, I can feel it, like, hanging on me, on my clothes. I looked around for it. I thought maybe there was some more mouldy food, or maybe an animal had gotten in and died, but I couldn't find it anywhere. So in the end, I was like, I have to go upstairs and check, which I'd never done before. Elizabeth would never let me upstairs. She said it wasn't polite for a person to see the host's bedroom or whatever. It wasn't right. But I had to. And as I went up the stairs, the smell just got worse and worse. I had to hold my nose to keep myself from gagging and retching. I checked all the rooms, and eventually the only one left was the bedroom, so I opened the door and it was pitch black because the curtains were closed. But as I stepped in, this wall of stench just hit me like a wave, and God, when I turned on the lights, Elizabeth was lying there. She was just laying in her bed. God. I tried not to look for more than a moment, but that image is seared into my mind. She was bigger, bloated. Like, I could barely tell it was her because her face was so twisted and contorted, like it had lost its form and looked like it was falling off the bones, there was this liquid oozing from her that had drenched into the sheets. Like, I had seen a few bugs around, but I hadn't realised why until that second. God, I could barely comprehend it. But then the smell hit me again, and it was like an attack on my senses, and I just fell back. And I stumbled to the bathroom and threw up. God, I can't even think about it now. I ran downstairs, and there she was, just standing there, staring at me, that fucking countdown music ringing in my ears as she smiled at me. This thing parading as my friend. I didn't know what to do. Didn't know that I knew. Could tell how terrified I was. So I just smiled. I said, "Oh, I'll be back in a few days." And as I turned to leave, I heard this cracking sound, you know, like when someone cracks their fingers. But it was like 1,000 fingers cracking again and again in different ways, faster and faster. And I knew it was that thing. And I was so scared. I heard the TV distort, and I heard her armchair falling over, and I had to turn around. It didn't look like Elizabeth anymore. Its legs and arms, its limbs were long and thin, impossibly thin. It's like the idea of Elizabeth that it was showing was now gone, and it was just this form, its true self or whatever, but it still had her skin stretched over it. And its eyes were like the holes of a mask, and they didn't seem to end, and its hair was long and grey, but it was floating above and around her head, like it was underwater, just constantly flowing and moving. And it tried to speak, and it was Elizabeth's voice, but echoing, reverberating around in my skull, and it smiled at me. This same sickly, sweet smile. And just as I was about to scream, as I was about to run, I felt this sense of peace, this calm, and then the feeling of someone holding my hand and gently pulling me out of the house. And I just let it guide me out of there. I've no clue how long I'd been staring at that thing, but I got out. And I turned to look at the house, and it was silent. All the lights were off. There was no sign of a TV that just seconds ago had been on. It just looked abandoned, cold and empty, like there was no sign of life in it at all. Elizabeth's daughter came to visit me at Guardian's, to thank me for looking after her mother. She was back from America for the funeral. Apparently, Elizabeth had been dead for 2 weeks before I started seeing her again. I have no clue how it wasn't obvious to me that she wasn't around anymore. How I couldn't tell that I wasn't speaking to her. And I don't know what it was that pulled me out of a house, but I'd like to think it was her spirit or her soul or something coming to protect me, to make sure that that thing didn't do anything. But now that I've had some time to think about it, I don't think it meant any harm. I think that maybe it was just there to keep her company, to make sure she wasn't alone in that house, to make sure she was found so that she could move on, you know. And maybe I just stumbled upon something on the way out, saw something I shouldn't have seen. God. But I guess I'll never know. And honestly, I think it's probably better that way.